There is a pattern that appears repeatedly in financial history, a pattern so consistent that it becomes almost invisible to those living inside it, where societies experience extraordinary wealth, cultural confidence, and commercial expansion while quietly misunderstanding the source of that prosperity, mistaking abundance for strength and activity for control. And it is only later, often too late, that the difference between wealth and sovereignty becomes clear. Because prosperity is not defined by how much a society produces or trades, but by who controls the structures that give that production meaning, permanence, and protection. And history shows that when wealth grows faster than institutions, the result is not stability, but exposure. At first glance, prosperity appears obvious and measurable, visible in bustling markets, rising incomes, expanding trade routes, and the accumulation of precious metals, goods, and capital. Yet these visible signs are only the surface expression of a deeper system, one built on legal authority, monetary control, enforcement mechanisms, and institutional continuity, and without these foundations, prosperity behaves less like a structure and more like a temporary concentration of resources, impressive to observe but fragile under pressure. This distinction matters because history repeatedly demonstrates that prosperity without sovereignty invites dependency, and dependency eventually invites capture, not through conquest alone, but through contracts, credit, enforcement, and financial architecture that shifts control away from those who create wealth toward those who define its rules. In the 18th century, Bengal stood as one of the most economically productive regions on Earth, a center of global manufacturing, textile production, agriculture, and trade, whose output rivaled entire European economies. And yet, beneath this extraordinary prosperity existed a structural imbalance that few recognized at the time, because Bengal's wealth flowed through markets and private actors, rather than through institutions capable of defending, regulating, and preserving it under external pressure. And this imbalance would prove decisive. The foundation of prosperity has never been wealth alone, despite how often history is told as a sequence of riches gained and lost, because wealth is a consequence, not a cause. And the true drivers of durable prosperity reside in systems that outlast individual fortunes, governments, and economic cycles. Systems that define ownership, adjudicate disputes, enforce contracts, regulate money, and maintain legitimacy even when conditions deteriorate. Strong and accountable institutions form the bedrock of this system, not because they eliminate risk or prevent crisis, but because they channel incentives in predictable ways, ensuring that economic actors operate within a framework that balances private ambition with public stability. And where such institutions exist, capital behaves differently. Long-term investment becomes rational, innovation compounds, and trust reduces transaction costs across the entire economy. The rule of law is central to this process, not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical mechanism that determines whether property rights are enforceable, contracts are honored, and power is constrained by norms rather than personalities. And when legal authority is fragmented or subordinate to private wealth, prosperity becomes negotiable, subject to influence, leverage, and betrayal rather than principle. Open economies have historically amplified prosperity by expanding markets, encouraging specialization, and integrating regions into global trade networks. Yet openness alone does not guarantee resilience, because openness without institutional depth creates exposure, allowing external actors to exploit gaps in enforcement, regulation, and financial control, transforming trade from mutual exchange into asymmetric dependence. Productive labor and division of work, long recognized as engines of economic growth, require more than effort and skill, because productivity scales only when supported by systems that coordinate capital, labor, infrastructure, and incentives. And when these systems are absent or externally controlled, productivity enriches intermediaries rather than the society that generates it. Bengal exemplified this contradiction, producing immense wealth through skilled labor, advanced manufacturing, and global trade, while lacking sovereign control over currency issuance, financial enforcement, and military-backed authority capable of defending economic autonomy. And this gap created an environment where private wealth substituted for institutional power, a substitution that appeared functional until stress revealed its limits. The preservation of financial sovereignty has historically depended on a state's ability to control money, credit, and enforcement within its territory, because currency is not merely a medium of exchange, but a tool of coordination, taxation, and power. And those who issue, regulate, and back currency determine whose obligations matter and whose do not when systems come under strain. Early manifestations of this control appeared in royal prerogatives over coinage, where the authority to mint money established not only economic order, but political legitimacy, linking taxation, military funding, and governance into a single system. And as economies grew more complex, this control evolved into institutional forms such as central banks and treasury systems designed to manage state finance and credit at scale. The establishment of central banking represented a critical refinement in financial sovereignty, not because it eliminated financial crises, but because it centralized decision-making authority over money creation, interest rates, and government financing, allowing states to absorb shocks, mobilize resources, and maintain continuity during periods of stress. And without such mechanisms, economies remained vulnerable to fragmentation and external manipulation. Regulation of capital flows further reinforce sovereignty by limiting the speed and direction of financial movements that could destabilize domestic economies, as seen in systems that balanced international trade with domestic monetary autonomy, preventing sudden outflows or speculative attacks that could overwhelm local institutions. And where such controls existed, states retained leverage over their own economic destiny. Sovereign money creation, whether through direct issuance or controlled banking systems, ensured that the benefits of monetary expansion accrued to the public sphere rather than being captured entirely by private intermediaries. And while imperfect, these systems aligned money creation with national priorities rather than external interests. A strong domestic financial sector reinforced this architecture by channeling savings into productive investment, supporting industry, and maintaining internal liquidity, reducing reliance on foreign capital, whose conditions often came with hidden costs. And when domestic finance weakened or became dependent on external actors, sovereignty eroded regardless of visible prosperity. The concept of an ultimate refinement stage of prosperity, though not formally defined in economic literature, can be understood historically as the point at which wealth, institutions, and sovereignty converge, creating a system resilient enough to withstand shocks without surrendering control, where economic growth no longer relies on external validation or protection, but on internally coherent structures capable of adaptation. This refinement does not produce perfect stability or eliminate inequality, but it does transform prosperity from a temporary condition into a durable one, capable of surviving leadership changes, market disruptions, and geopolitical shifts. And history shows that societies that reached this stage maintained influence long after their initial wealth peaks. Bengal, for all its economic brilliance, never completed this refinement because its prosperity rested on production and trade rather than institutional sovereignty. And when external actors arrived with superior organizational structures, military backing, and financial systems, they did not need to destroy Bengal's economy, only to redirect it. The mechanisms that created dependency were subtle, operating through contracts, financing arrangements, and enforcement asymmetries that gradually shifted control away from local authorities. And as these mechanisms expanded, warnings were ignored because markets continued to function, trade continued to grow, and wealth continued to accumulate, masking the underlying transfer of power. Private financiers accumulated influence precisely because institutions lacked the capacity to regulate or replace them. And this concentration of financial power created vulnerabilities, as loyalty became negotiable and incentives aligned with survival rather than sovereignty, a condition that external actors could exploit with precision. When conditions changed, when political instability emerged, when military pressure increased, and when financial obligations came due, the absence of sovereign institutions revealed itself abruptly as private wealth proved incapable of defending public order and economic abundance failed to translate into strategic leverage. The long-term consequences were not immediate collapse, but gradual subordination. As revenue streams were redirected, decision-making authority migrated outward, and prosperity continued in altered form, benefiting new centers of power while leaving the original producers increasingly constrained. This pattern was not unique to Bengal, nor confined to colonial history. because similar dynamics appear whenever economic growth outpaces institutional development, creating systems that function efficiently under normal conditions but fail catastrophically under stress, transferring control to those with enforcement capacity rather than those with productive capacity. The lesson is not that wealth invites betrayal, but that systems without sovereignty invite reconfiguration, and reconfiguration favors those who control institutions rather than those who generate output, a principle that remains consistent across centuries and geographies. In the aftermath of Bengal's transformation, global financial systems increasingly reflected this understanding, as emerging powers invested heavily in institutional frameworks designed to secure monetary control, regulate capital, and enforce contracts, recognizing that prosperity required architecture as much as activity. The evolution of modern financial sovereignty reflects accumulated historical experience, incorporating lessons learned from earlier failures, where states that once relied on private wealth or informal arrangements moved towards centralized systems capable of coordinating national economies under pressure. This shift did not eliminate financial crises or prevent mismanagement, but it altered the balance of power, ensuring that economic disruptions did not automatically result in loss of sovereignty and that wealth, even when unevenly distributed, remained anchored to domestic institutions. Today, discussions of prosperity often focus on metrics such as growth rates, market capitalization, and technological innovation. Yet these indicators reveal little about underlying resilience, because prosperity remains contingent on institutional strength, monetary control, and governance capacity that operate quietly beneath visible outcomes. The refinement of prosperity, when it occurs, is rarely celebrated because it lacks spectacle, unfolding through legal reforms, administrative capacity building, and financial system development that attract little attention until their absence becomes costly. History suggests that prosperity endures not where wealth is greatest, but where systems are strongest, where money, law, and authority reinforce one another, and where economic success cannot be easily detached from sovereign control. The story of Bengal, and of countless other prosperous societies that misunderstood this relationship, serves not as a moral lesson, but as an analytical one, illustrating how wealth behaves when separated from power, and how power eventually reorganizes wealth to reflect institutional realities. In this sense, prosperity is less a destination than a condition that must be maintained, requiring constant alignment between economic activity and institutional authority. And when that alignment weakens, prosperity becomes provisional, subject to forces beyond local control. The quiet truth of financial history is that prosperity rarely disappears overnight, but it often changes ownership, flowing toward those who control the frameworks within which it operates, leaving behind the illusion of continuity even as the substance shifts elsewhere. Understanding this dynamic reveals why the foundation of prosperity lies not in abundance alone, but in the systems that define, defend, and refine it, and why societies that fail to complete this refinement eventually discover that wealth without sovereignty is not a safeguard, but an invitation. And it is in this understated, often overlooked space between wealth and control that history continues to shape the fortunes of nations, long after the markets close and the caravans move on.